The path narrowed as it climbed, pressed between dark stone on one side and a slope of pale drifts on the other. Snow had been falling long enough to soften the edges of everything. It rested along the branches of the pines in quiet layers, gathered in the seams of rock, and settled over the road in a smooth, unbroken cover. The old track remained visible only where the ground dipped slightly from long use. Even that shape had begun to fade beneath the steady snowfall. The wind moved through the mountain pass in a consistent flow. It passed through the pines, along the rock face, and across the path without force. Loose snow shifted along the surface in thin, uneven lines. Cloaks and fabric moved slightly with each passing current, then settled again. They walked without speaking. Brenna moved at the front, her steps measured and even. Snow collected along the shoulders of her fur-lined cloak and along the edge of her collar. Her axe remained secured across her back, unmoving. At times, she placed a gloved hand against the stone wall beside the path, registering its surface before continuing. Edrin followed a short distance behind, his satchel kept close beneath his cloak. Snow gathered along the seam of the leather and along the folds of his clothing before shifting away with the wind. His gaze moved occasionally toward the branches overhead, where the snow had settled unevenly across the pine limbs. Kayla walked slightly apart from the others at times, then returned to the shared rhythm of the group. Her hood held a thin line of snow along its edge. The curve of her bow rose above her shoulder beneath the cloak. She adjusted her position along the path, sometimes nearer the outer edge, sometimes a step behind, observing the ground and the surrounding stone. Thomas followed at the rear. The hem of his robes darkened near the ankles from contact with the snow. A faint lantern glow remained near him, softened by the snowfall and the dim light of the pass. It did not extend far, remaining close and steady. Their footsteps formed a quiet, consistent rhythm. The snow absorbed most of the sound, each step pressing down before lifting again. In places where the surface thinned, a firmer note briefly emerged beneath the snow, then faded as the path softened again. The pace remained unchanged. The pass curved gradually, revealing only short distances at a time. The rock face rose closer at one turn, narrowing the path. Frost had formed in the cracks, pale against the darker stone. Snow had settled into the deeper seams. Beyond the bend, the path widened slightly before narrowing again. A small stand of pines appeared through the snowfall, their branches weighed down and still. The trunks remained dark against the surrounding white. The group passed them without pause. The same elements continued along the pass, changing only in small ways. Rock, snow, wind, and the faint line of the road remained consistent as they moved forward. The group slowed slightly. Ahead, through the snowfall, a vertical shape became visible. At first it appeared as a darker presence within the white, indistinct and partially obscured. As they remained in place, its edges became clearer. Straight lines emerged through the snowfall. The watchtower stood farther along the pass, its form partially hidden by distance and falling snow. Its stone matched the surrounding rock, making it difficult to distinguish at a glance. Snow had gathered along its ledges and across the roof, softening its edges. The tower had remained in place, partially obscured by the snowfall. No one spoke. After a moment, they continued forward. As they approached, more of the structure became visible. A lower wall emerged first, followed by the angled line of the roof. A narrow window appeared, unlit. Wooden supports extended along one side, weathered but intact. The wind shifted slightly around the structure. Snow had gathered more heavily along one side of the tower, forming a gradual rise against the stone. Near the entrance, the surface of the ground was firmer, shaped by the movement of air. Brenna reached the door and placed a hand against it. Snow slipped from her sleeve as she made contact. The wood was dark and worn, reinforced with iron bands. Frost traced the edges of the hinges. Edrin stood nearby, his attention passing briefly over the threshold stone, where faint marks remained from past use. Kayla's gaze moved upward toward the higher openings of the tower, where snow passed steadily beyond them. Thomas remained slightly behind, the faint glow near him resting softly against the snow at his feet. They stood for a short time without movement. Behind them, the path had begun to soften as snowfall continued, their footprints losing definition. The surrounding pass remained unchanged, the wind continuing its steady movement through the space. The tower remained unchanged as they approached. Snow continued to fall. The wind continued through the pass, and the group remained there at the threshold without urgency. Brenna's hand stayed on the door for a moment before she applied a steady forward pressure. The wood shifted with a low, restrained sound as the seal of cold loosened along its edges. Snow that had gathered along the frame fell in a soft line as the door moved inward. The hinges held without resistance, opening at an even pace. The interior was dim. Cold air settled just inside the threshold, undisturbed except for the slow movement created by the opening door. The group stepped forward in sequence, crossing from the snow-covered ground onto the worn stone floor within. Their footsteps changed in sound. The snow no longer absorbed the impact. Each step carried a quieter, firmer note against the stone beneath. Moisture from their boots marked the surface briefly before fading into the cold air. The door stayed partially open behind them. Snow continued to fall outside, visible through the narrow gap. A thin line of white collected along the threshold, where wind pushed it inward. The space inside the tower was intact. Stone walls rose evenly on all sides, their surfaces marked by time, but not damage. Wooden beams crossed overhead, darkened with age. A central table stood near the middle of the room, its surface clear except for a thin layer of settled dust. Shelves lined one wall, holding tools and objects arranged in a consistent order. Nothing appeared disturbed. Brenna stepped further inside, clearing the entrance. The others followed, spreading slightly through the space without direction or discussion. The movement was gradual and unassigned. Edrin paused near the shelves, his attention passing over the items placed there. Small containers, tools, and folded materials stayed positioned in a way that suggested continued use, though none had been handled recently. A light layer of dust rested across their surfaces, even and undisturbed. Kayla moved along the inner wall, her steps quiet against the stone. She passed near a narrow window set into the structure. Snow moved steadily beyond it, the exterior unchanged from the pass they had crossed. Thomas entered last, allowing the door to stay open behind him. The faint glow near him stayed contained, resting close to his position and adding a slight warmth to the immediate space without changing the overall dimness. The air inside was still. It held the same cold as the outside, though without wind. The absence of movement allowed the quiet to settle more completely within the room. The door shifted slightly as the wind moved again. Brenna turned and placed her hand against it once more. With a steady motion, she brought it closed. The wood met the frame with a soft, contained sound. The remaining gap of light from outside narrowed and disappeared. The interior settled. The only remaining light entered through the narrow windows, diffused by the snowfall beyond. It provided a soft, even illumination that left no sharp edges. The group stayed in place for a moment. Their presence did not alter the arrangement of the space. The room continued as it had before, now occupied but unchanged. Brenna stepped towards the central table and rested her hand briefly against its surface. Dust shifted slightly beneath her touch, leaving a faint mark that stayed visible. Edrin adjusted the position of his satchel, then allowed it to rest again at his side. Kayla paused near the wall, her attention moving across the interior without focusing on any single point. Thomas stood near the entrance, the faint glow beside him steady and contained. No one spoke. The structure held without change. The beams and walls stayed still. A small amount of snow had entered before the door was closed, resting near the threshold. It began to melt slowly against the stone, forming a thin, darkened patch that spread slightly before settling. The group began to move again. Brenna stepped away from the table, her movement unhurried. Edrin shifted along the shelves, observing the arrangement without altering it. Kayla adjusted her position along the wall, maintaining a clear view of both the interior and the window. Thomas moved a few steps further inside, the faint glow following without change. Each step was quiet. Each motion stayed contained. The space adjusted to their presence without resistance. The interior had been unused, but not abandoned. The structure held its form. The objects stayed where they belonged. The air stayed still. Outside, the snowfall continued. Inside, nothing required change, and the tower stayed as it was, now occupied, without interruption. The shelves along the wall held their arrangement without change. Edrin stood nearest to them, his attention moving across the objects in sequence. Small containers, bundled materials, and tools were placed in a consistent order, each occupying a defined space. None showed signs of recent use. A narrow gap between two stacks revealed a bound object set slightly behind the others. Edrin reached for it. The cover was firm and worn, its surface darkened. A thin layer of dust rested across it, disturbed as his hand made contact. He lifted it free without resistance and brought it to the central table. Brenna stood nearby as he placed it down. The book opened with a soft shift of its spine. The pages within were intact. The edges had thickened slightly from use, but no tearing was visible. The surface of each page held a faint texture where ink had settled. Edrin turned the first page. The writing was structured. Each line followed the same format, evenly spaced, aligned along a consistent margin. The ink had faded slightly in earlier entries, though the form remained clear. Wind direction, snowfall, visibility. No additional notes appeared between them. He turned another page. The entries continued in the same structure. Wind direction noted first, followed by snowfall, then visibility. The phrasing remained brief and consistent. The handwriting shifted slightly from one section to another. Some entries were written with a firmer hand, the lines more defined. Others were lighter, the ink thinner where pressure had lessened. The spacing remained consistent across all pages. Brenna rested her hand lightly on the edge of the table. Kayla moved a step closer, her gaze directed toward the open pages without leaning in. Thomas remained where he stood, the faint glow near him steady. Edrin turned another page. The structure continued. Wind direction, snowfall, visibility. He turned the next page. The entries followed the same format, each line placed carefully beneath the last. The wording didn't change. Kayla adjusted her position slightly beside the table. Brenna remained still. Thomas moved a step closer, though he did not look directly at the pages. Edrin reached another section. The handwriting changed again. The angle of the letters adjusted slightly. The spacing remained consistent, though the pressure appeared different. The lines were steady. The entries continued in the same order: wind direction, snowfall, then visibility, each recorded without variation. He turned another page. The pattern held. Wind direction, snowfall, visibility. The sound of each page was soft and even. The paper moved without resistance, settling flat after each turn. The ink showed small differences in tone. Earlier entries appeared slightly lighter. Later entries held more definition. The variation remained subtle. Edrin continued forward. The entries stayed aligned. The spacing did not change. No lines were crossed out. No additional markings appeared. Each entry filled its place and stopped. He turned another page. The same structure continued. Wind direction noted. Snowfall recorded. Visibility described. Kayla remained beside the table. Brenna remained still. Thomas stood nearby, the faint glow unchanged. Edrin reached the final written page. The last entry followed the same format as the others. Wind direction, snowfall, visibility. The line ended where the others had ended. The page after it was blank. He turned one more page. The next page was empty. No markings appeared. He closed the book slightly, leaving it resting open on the table. The pages settled without movement. Brenna's hand stayed near the edge of the surface. Kayla stood beside the table, her gaze steady. Thomas stood nearby, the faint glow unchanged. Edrin rested his hand lightly against the edge of the book. No one spoke. The room was still. The shelves held their arrangement. The table stayed in place. The book remained open on the table. Outside, the snowfall continued. The upper level was reached by a narrow stair set along the inner wall. Brenna moved first, placing her foot on the first step and continuing upward at a steady pace. The wood held firm beneath her weight. A thin layer of dust shifted with each step, settling again after she passed. The others followed without pause. The stair turned once before opening into the upper level of the tower. The space above was smaller than the room below. The ceiling sloped slightly beneath the roof. Openings were set into the walls on all sides, narrow and evenly spaced. Snow moved past them in a steady flow, visible through each gap. At the center of the room stood the lantern structure. It was fixed into place, supported by a metal frame secured to the floor and ceiling. The housing was enclosed in glass panels, clouded slightly by residue and fine dust. The metal showed signs of wear, though no damage was visible. Brenna stepped toward it. Her hand moved to the frame first, resting against the metal to steady it. The structure did not shift. Edrin moved to one side, examining the base where the fuel was stored. A small compartment was built into the lower section, secured by a latch. Kayla stood near one of the wall openings, her position allowing a view of both the interior and the pass beyond. Thomas stepped into the space beside the lantern, the faint glow near him unchanged. Brenna released the frame and reached for the latch. The metal lifted with a small movement. The compartment opened without resistance. Inside, a container was set into place. Edrin reached down and lifted it free. The weight stayed steady in his hand. He adjusted his grip slightly and removed the cap with a controlled motion. The air remained unchanged. He set the cap aside and positioned the container near the intake. Brenna adjusted the position of the housing above, releasing a second latch that allowed access to the inner chamber. The glass panel shifted outward, held in place by a hinge. A thin layer of residue marked the interior surface. Edrin tilted the container. The liquid moved in a steady line, guided into the intake without spilling. He stopped after a measured amount and returned the container to an upright position. The cap was secured again. He placed the container back into the compartment and closed it. Brenna returned the glass panel to its original position and secured the latch. The panel settled into place without sound. The interior of the lantern was unlit. Thomas stepped slightly closer. His hand moved toward the base of the chamber. The motion was controlled, without pause. A small tool was set into a holder along the frame. He removed it and positioned it within the housing. The contact point aligned without adjustment. A brief movement followed. The ignition occurred without sound. A small flame formed within the chamber. It held its position at the base, steady and contained. Thomas removed the tool and returned it to its place along the frame. Brenna kept her hand near the outer structure, observing the stability of the housing. Edrin stepped back from the compartment. Kayla remained near the wall opening, her position unchanged. The flame continued. It didn't shift beyond small, consistent movement. The glass panel held it in place. The metal frame did not move. The air in the room was still. The group stayed where they were. No one spoke. The lantern continued to burn. The openings in the walls showed the snowfall moving at the same pace as before. Inside the chamber, the flame held steady. no further adjustment was made. The structure stayed intact. The lantern stayed in operation. The room continued as it had. The lantern stayed lit above. The flame held steady within the glass, contained and unchanged. The metal frame did not shift. The openings along the upper level continued to show the snowfall passing at a consistent pace. The group moved down the stair. Their steps followed the curve without pause. The wood beneath their feet carried a soft, even sound, shifting back to stone as they reached the lower level. The room below remained as it had been. The table stood at the center. The shelves held their arrangement. The door stayed closed. A faint trace of moisture remained near the threshold where snow had settled earlier. The book remained open on the table. Edrin stepped toward it. His movement was steady. He reached the table and rested his hand near the edge of the page before adjusting the book slightly. The shift was small, aligning it more evenly with the surface. The pages moved without resistance. The last written entry remained visible. Wind direction, snowfall, visibility. The lines were evenly spaced. The page beneath remained blank. Edrin remained in place for a moment. Brenna stood a short distance away, her posture unchanged. Kayla remained near the wall, positioned between the table and the window. Thomas stood nearby, the faint glow near him steady. Edrin reached for a writing tool resting along the table. It lay parallel to the edge. He lifted it and adjusted his grip once before positioning it above the page. The tip hovered briefly. Then it lowered to the paper. The first line was written. Wind direction. The letters formed with even pressure. The spacing matched the entries above. The line aligned with the margin without adjustment. He lifted the tool slightly, then moved to the next line. Snowfall. The wording remained consistent with the previous entries. The spacing did not shift. The letters held the same proportion. He continued. Visibility. The final line aligned beneath the others. The entry followed the same structure. Edrin lifted the tool. No additional marks were made. The line ended where the others had ended. The page held the new entry beneath the last. He paused briefly, then lowered the tool again. A second entry began. Wind direction. The letters formed in the same spacing as before. He moved down. Snowfall. The pressure remained consistent. He continued. visibility. The line aligned with the others. He lifted the tool. The entry stopped. No variation appeared between the two. Edrin remained in place. He looked down at the page. The entries stayed aligned. The spacing did not change. He lowered the tool again. Another entry was written. Wind direction. The letters followed the same pattern. Snowfall. The spacing remained even. Visibility. The line ended. He lifted the tool. The ink settled into the page. The surface of the paper held each line without distortion. Edrin set the tool down. It returned to its place along the table, resting parallel to the edge. The book remained open. The entries continued down the page, each following the same format. Wind direction noted first, followed by snowfall, then visibility. No additional markings appeared. Brenner did not move. Kayla remained in position near the wall. Thomas stood nearby, the faint glow unchanged. The room stayed still. The shelves held their arrangement. The table remained in place. The door stayed closed. Edrin adjusted the position of the book slightly. The pages shifted a small amount, then settled flat again. The entries remained aligned. No lines were crossed out. No space was left unused. Each entry followed the one before it. Wind direction. Snowfall. Visibility. His hand rested briefly near the edge of the book, then lifted away. No further marks were made. The book stayed open on the table. The new entries remained beneath the previous ones, aligned in the same format. The room remained unchanged. Above them, the lantern continued to burn. The flame stayed steady within the glass. The air in the room was still. No one spoke. The table held the book. The shelves held their contents. The door remained closed. The book remained open on the table. The book remained open on the table. The entries held their alignment. The ink had settled into the page. No additional marks appeared. Edrin stepped away from the table. He adjusted the position of his satchel once before turning towards the shelves along the wall. His movement was steady, without pause. His hand moved across the surface of the wood, clearing a thin layer of dust. The dust shifted, then settled again along the edge. He lifted one of the containers. The lid turned with a small motion. He checked its contents briefly, then returned it to its place. The position matched the others. His hand moved to the next item. The lid loosened, then closed again. The container was set back into alignment. He continued. Brenna stood near the center of the room. After a moment, she stepped toward the wall opposite the shelves. Her hand moved across the stone, brushing a narrow line through the dust. The surface beneath remained unchanged. She shifted slightly and repeated the motion along another section. The dust moved in small amounts and settled again. Kayla stood near the window. Her gaze moved outward through the narrow opening, following the snowfall for a moment before returning to the room. A small object rested along the sill. She adjusted it once, aligning it with the edge, then stepped back into place. Thomas stood near the table. His attention passed over the surface, then toward one of the chairs nearby. He moved it slightly, bringing it into alignment with the table. The movement was small. The chair settled and did not shift again. The room stayed quiet between movements. Edrin moved along the shelves. Another container was lifted. The lid turned. He checked it, then returned it to its place. His hand moved to a bundle beside it. He pressed lightly against the surface, then released it. Nothing shifted out of place. He continued along the row. Each item was handled once. The motion varied slightly with each object. Some lids turned more easily. Others required a firmer grip. The movement remained controlled. Brenna continued along the wall. Her hand passed across another section of stone. The dust shifted in a thin line, then settled again near the base. She stepped back, then moved a short distance along the wall and repeated the motion. The pattern continued without change. Kayla adjusted her position slightly. She stepped once along the wall, then returned to stillness near the window. Her gaze moved across the interior, then outward again. Thomas moved toward the center of the room. He paused near the table, then stepped away without making further adjustments. The chair remained aligned. The table did not shift. The book stayed open. The room held its structure. Edrin moved to the lower shelf. His hand passed across the surface, clearing another thin line of dust. He paused at one of the containers, lifted it, and turned it once before setting it back. The position matched the others. He reached the next item. The lid turned. He checked it, then closed it again. His hand moved along the shelf, stopping briefly at each object. Some were lifted. Some were pressed lightly. Each returned to its place. Brenna stepped toward the table. Her hand moved along the edge. She shifted it slightly, adjusting its position by a small amount. The movement was controlled. The table settled and did not move again. She stepped back. Kayla took a step along the wall. She paused near the corner, then returned to her previous position near the window. The object along the sill remained aligned. Thomas moved toward the stair. His hand rested briefly against the railing. He remained there for a moment, then released it and stepped back. The stair did not shift. Edrin reached the final section of the shelf. He lifted one last container. The lid turned. He checked its contents, then returned it to its place. He adjusted its position slightly, aligning it with the edge of the shelf. His hand lowered. The shelf held its arrangement. He moved back from the wall. Brenna stepped away from the table. Her position returned to the center of the room. Kayla remained near the window. Thomas stood nearby. The faint glow near him stayed unchanged. The room stayed still. The shelves held their contents. The table stayed aligned. The book remained open. The door stayed closed. Above them, the lantern continued to burn. The flame held steady within the glass. The air in the room was still. No one spoke. After a moment, movement continued again. Edrin returned to the shelves. He moved his hand across the surface once more, clearing a small area where dust had settled again. He paused at one of the containers he had already checked. He lifted it. The lid turned. He checked it again, then returned it to its place. The position remained consistent. Brenna stepped toward the wall. Her hand moved across another section of stone. The dust shifted slightly. She stepped back. Kayla adjusted her stance once. She remained near the window. Thomas stepped toward the table, then stopped. No further adjustment was made. The room held its structure. The movements repeated with small variations. No items were removed. No positions changed beyond slight adjustments. The shelves stayed aligned. The table did not shift. The book remained open on the table. The door stayed closed. Above, the lantern continued to burn. The flame held steady. The air remained still. No one spoke. Movement slowed, then continued again in the same way as before. The stair led upward to the top level of the tower. The group moved toward it without pause. Brenna stepped first, placing her foot on the first step and continuing upward at a steady pace. The wood held firm beneath her weight. A thin layer of dust shifted slightly beneath each step, then settled again as she moved past. The others followed in the same order. The sound of their movement remained soft and even along the stair. The turn in the structure guided them upward before the space opened above. The upper level was enclosed by stone on all sides. Narrow openings were set at regular intervals along the walls. Each opening showed a section of the pass beyond. Snow moved past them in a steady, continuous flow. The lantern stood at the center. The flame held steady within the glass. Brenna stepped into the space and moved toward one of the openings. She stopped at a consistent distance from the wall. Edrin stepped to an opening nearby. Kayla moved along the perimeter, passing one opening before stopping at another. Thomas held closer to the center, the faint glow near him unchanged. The space held still. The air inside did not move. Outside, the wind passed through the openings without entering fully. Snow crossed each gap at a steady pace, forming thin, continuous lines as it moved through the field of view. The pass extended outward. Rock faces rose on either side, their surfaces partially covered in snow. The texture of the stone remained visible in sections where the snow had not settled fully. The ground below held an even layer. The path ran through the center as a narrow, worn line. Its edges were softened by the snowfall, but its direction remained clear. No movement appeared along it. Brenna remained at the opening. Her posture did not change. Edrin stood at the adjacent opening. His gaze moved once along the length of the pass, then settled. Kayla stood near the wall. She adjusted her position slightly, stepping closer to the opening before stopping again. Thomas stepped a small distance toward the perimeter. He paused near one of the openings, but did not move closer. The lantern continued to burn at the center. The flame held steady within the glass. The light remained limited to the immediate area. Beyond it, the space remained dim the snowfall continued. The direction of the wind did not change. The snow moved at the same pace across each opening. The visibility remained consistent. The far edges of the pass held partially obscured. No figures appeared. The path remained empty. Brenna shifted her weight once. Her position changed slightly, then held again. Edrin placed his hand briefly against the stone beside the opening. He released it without looking down. Kayla stepped along the wall, moving past one opening before stopping at the next. She remained there. Thomas returned to a position nearer the center. The faint glow near him stayed unchanged. The group remained distributed across the space. The arrangement did not shift beyond small adjustments. The openings continued to frame the pass. Each showed a similar view: snow moving, stone holding its shape, the path continuing through the center. The edges of the path softened further as snowfall continued. No tracks were visible beyond those already present. No new marks appeared. The wind maintained its direction. The snow crossed each opening at a steady angle. The pattern held consistent. Brenna remained at the opening. Edrin stood nearby. Kayla did not move. Thomas remained within the center of the room. The lantern continued to burn. The flame held steady within the glass. The air inside the tower was still. No sound carried beyond the soft movement of wind outside. The group did not speak. Time passed without measure. The snowfall did not increase or decrease. The visibility did not change. The pass remained as it had been. Brenna stepped slightly to one side. Her position shifted along the opening. She stopped again. Edrin adjusted his stance once. His hand moved from the stone to his side. Kayla shifted her weight, then held still. Thomas stepped once toward the perimeter, then stopped before reaching the wall. The lantern remained at the center. The flame held steady within the glass. The openings continued to show the same movement of snow. The rock faces held their shape. The path remained visible. No movement appeared along it. No figures entered the pass. No changes were observed. The group remained at the openings. Their positions adjusted slightly over time. Each movement was small. Each returned to stillness. The arrangement of the space remained consistent. The lantern burned. The air stayed still. Outside, the snowfall continued. The pass extended beyond view. The path remained empty. The lantern remained lit above. The flame held steady within the glass. The light stayed contained near the center of the upper level. No change in its position was visible. Below, the room continued as it had. The book remained open on the table. The entries held their alignment. The ink had settled into the page. No new marks appeared. Edrin stood near the shelves. His hand moved across the surface, clearing a thin layer of dust that had gathered again. The motion was steady, covering a small section before stopping. The dust shifted, then settled along the edge. He lifted a container. The lid turned. He checked it, then returned it to its place. His hand moved to another item. The lid loosened, then closed again. The container was set back into alignment. He paused briefly, then continued along the row. Brenna stood near the wall. Her hand moved across the stone, tracing a line through the dust. The surface beneath did not change. She stepped to the side and repeated the motion along another section. The dust shifted in a narrow line. It settled again near the base. Kayla stood near the window. Her gaze moved outward for a moment, then returned to the interior. She adjusted her stance slightly, then held still. The object along the sill remained aligned. Thomas stood near the center of the room. The faint glow near him did not change. He stepped toward the table. His hand moved along the edge, checking its position without shifting it further. He stepped back. The table did not move. The room remained still between movements. Then movement resumed. Edrin returned to the beginning of the shelf. He lifted a container he had already checked. The lid turned. He checked it again, then set it back. The position matched the others. His hand moved along the shelf, pressing lightly against a bundle before releasing it. Nothing shifted out of place. He continued. Another container was lifted. The lid turned more slowly this time. He checked it, then closed it again. The container returned to its place. Brenna moved along the wall. Her hand passed across another section of stone. The dust shifted slightly, then settled again. She stepped back, then forward again, repeating the motion in a nearby section. The pattern continued without change. Kayla stepped once along the wall. She paused at the next opening, looking outward briefly before returning her gaze to the room. She stepped back to her previous position. Thomas moved toward the stair. His hand rested briefly against the railing. He remained there for a moment, then released it. He stepped back toward the center. The faint glow near him remained steady. Edrin moved to the lower shelf. His hand cleared a small section of dust. He paused at a container. The lid turned. He checked it, then set it back. His hand moved to the next item. He lifted it, turned it, set it down. The position matched the others. Brenna stepped toward the table. Her hand moved along the edge. She adjusted it slightly. The movement was small. The table settled. She stepped away. Kayla shifted her stance once. She remained near the window. The object along the sill did not move. Thomas stepped toward the table, then stopped. No adjustment followed. The room held its structure. The shelves held their arrangement. The table remained aligned. The book stayed open. The door stayed closed. Above, the lantern continued to burn. The flame held steady within the glass. The air in the room was still. No one spoke. After a time, movement continued again. Edrin returned to the shelves. His hand moved across the surface, clearing a small section where dust had gathered again. He paused at a container, lifted it, turned the lid, checked it, returned it. His hand moved along the row. Some items were touched. Some were lifted. Each returned to its place. Brenna moved along the wall. Her hand passed across another section of stone. The dust shifted slightly. She stepped back, then repeated the motion nearby. Kayla stepped once along the wall. She paused near the opening. Her gaze moved outward, then returned to the interior. She remained there. Thomas moved toward the stair again. His hand touched the railing briefly. He released it. He stepped back. The movement remained consistent. No changes were made beyond small adjustments. The shelves stayed aligned. The table did not shift. The book remained open on the table. The door stayed closed. Above, the lantern continued to burn. The flame held steady. The air remained still. No one spoke. The movement slowed, then continued again in the same way as before. Edrin reached the shelves once more. His hand moved across the surface. He lifted a container he had already checked. The lid turned. He checked it again. He returned it to its place. The position remained consistent. Brenna stepped toward the wall. Her hand moved across the stone. The dust shifted slightly. She stepped back. Kayla adjusted her stance once. She remained near the window. Thomas stepped toward the table, then stopped. No further movement followed. The room held its structure. The shelves held their arrangement. The table remained aligned. The book remained open. The door stayed closed. Above, the lantern continued to burn. The flame held steady within the glass. The air remained still. No one spoke. The movements continued in the same pattern. Small adjustments, brief pauses, return to stillness, then movement again. The lantern remained lit above. Its flame held steady within the glass, unchanged in size or position. The metal frame remained fixed at the center of the upper level. The narrow openings around it continued to show the snowfall moving through the pass. Below, the lower room held its structure. The table stood at the center. The shelves along the wall held their contents in even alignment. The chair remained positioned near the table. The door stayed closed. The book remained open. The entries on the page held their spacing. The ink had settled fully. No new marks appeared. Edrin stood near the shelves. His hand moved along the wood, passing over the surface where dust had gathered again in a thin layer. He cleared a narrow section, then paused at one of the containers. He lifted it. The lid turned with a small motion. He checked the contents briefly, then returned it to its place. His hand moved to the next item. A folded bundle rested beside a second container. He pressed lightly against the bundle, released it, and moved on. Nothing shifted out of alignment. Brenna stood near the wall opposite the shelves. Her hand passed across the stone, tracing another line through the dust. The motion remained even from one end of the section to the other. Dust shifted beneath her palm, then settled again near the base of the wall. She stepped a short distance to the side and repeated the motion. The surface held the same texture as before. Kayla stood near the window. Her gaze moved outward through the opening for a short time, following the snowfall as it crossed the gap. She then turned her attention back to the room. A small object remained on the sill. She adjusted it once, aligning it more evenly with the edge, then returned her hand to her side. Thomas stood near the center. The faint glow near him remained unchanged. He stepped toward the table and placed his hand lightly against its edge. The table did not shift beneath the contact. He released it and stepped back again. The room was quiet between movements. Then movement continued. Edrin reached the end of the shelf and returned to the beginning without hurry. He lifted a container he had already checked earlier. The lid turned. He looked inside, then closed it and returned it to the same place. His hand moved to another item. The container beside it was heavier. He adjusted his grip once as he lifted it, then set it back after checking it. The positions along the shelf remained even. Brenna moved along the wall. Her hand passed over another section of stone. Dust shifted in a narrow line, then settled again. She stepped back, then moved a little farther along and repeated the motion across a lower section. The wall remained unchanged. Kayla stepped once along the window wall. She paused near the next opening and looked outward again. Snow crossed the gap at the same angle as before. The pass beyond remained partially obscured, though the narrow road below could still be followed between the rock faces. No movement appeared along it. She stepped back to her previous position. Thomas moved toward the chair near the table. His hand rested on the top edge. He adjusted the chair by a small amount, bringing it into clearer alignment with the table, then released it. The chair settled and did not move again. Above them, the lantern continued to burn. The flame held steady within the glass. The room below remained dim, except for the light carried down from above, and the faint glow beside Thomas. The air remained still. No one spoke. After a time, movement continued again. Edrin moved to the lower shelf. He cleared another narrow section of dust with the side of his hand, then paused at a container placed near the back. He lifted it free, turned the lid, checked it, then returned it to the same position. A second container followed. This one opened more easily. He checked it and placed it back beside the first. His hand passed along the row, stopping briefly at each object. Some were lifted, some were turned, some were only touched before his hand moved on. Each stayed where it belonged. Brenna stepped toward the table. She placed her hand along the edge and shifted it slightly. The movement was small. The table settled and did not move again. She stepped back toward the wall. Kayla adjusted her stance near the window. Her shoulder turned slightly toward the opening, then back toward the room. The object on the sill remained aligned. Snow continued to cross the opening in a steady pattern. Thomas moved toward the stair. He placed his hand briefly against the railing, then released it and returned to the center of the room. The faint glow near him did not change. The book remained open on the table. The page did not move. The last lines remained visible. Wind direction. Snowfall. Visibility. No additional entry followed. The shelves held their arrangement. The table remained aligned. The chair held its position. The door stayed closed. Above, the lantern continued to burn. The flame held steady. The air in the room was still. No one spoke. The pattern of movement continued without hurry. Edrin returned once more to the shelves. He lifted a container he had already handled before. The lid turned with a familiar motion. He checked it, closed it, and returned it to its place. His hand then moved to a folded bundle beside it, pressing lightly against the surface before releasing it. Brenna passed her hand across another section of wall. Dust shifted slightly. She stepped back. Kayla moved one step along the sill, then stopped. Her gaze turned outward, then returned to the interior. Thomas stepped towards the table, rested his hand near the edge of the open book, then drew it back without touching the page. The room held steady around them. Movement continued in one part of the room, while stillness held in another. Edrin checked one final container along the lower shelf. Brenna moved along the wall. Kayla held her position at the opening. Thomas returned to the center. The faint glow remained close beside him. The room stayed quiet. The air remained still. No one spoke. The flame held steady within the glass. The air remained still. The lantern remained lit above. The flame held steady within the glass. The light remained contained near the center of the upper level. The openings around it continued to show the snowfall moving across the pass. Below, the room held its structure. The table stood at the center. The shelves held their arrangement. The chair remained aligned. The door stayed closed. The book remained open. The entries on the page held their spacing. The ink had settled. No new marks appeared. Edrin stood near the shelves. His hand moved across the surface of the wood, clearing a thin layer of dust that had gathered again. The motion remained even, covering a small section before stopping. The dust shifted and settled along the edge. He lifted a container. The lid turned. He checked it briefly, then returned it to its place. His hand moved to another item. He lifted it, adjusted it slightly, then set it back. The position matched the others. Brenna stood near the wall. Her hand passed across the stone, tracing a narrow line through the dust. The motion remained steady from one end of the section to the other. She stepped to the side. Her hand moved across another section. The dust shifted, then settled again near the base. Kayla stood near the window. Her gaze moved outward for a moment, following the snowfall through the opening. She returned her attention to the room. The object on the sill remained aligned. She adjusted her stance slightly, then held still. Thomas stood near the center. The faint glow near him remained unchanged. He stepped toward the table. His hand rested near the edge, then lifted away. The table did not move. The room remained quiet between movements. Then movement continued again. Edrin returned to the beginning of the shelf. He lifted a container he had already checked. The lid turned. He checked it again. He returned it to its place. His hand moved along the row. He paused at a bundle, pressed lightly, released, moved on. Brenna stepped along the wall. Her hand moved across another section of stone. The dust shifted slightly. She stepped back, then forward again, repeating the motion nearby. Kayla took a step along the window wall. She paused at the next opening. Her gaze moved outward, then returned to the interior. She stepped back to her previous position. Thomas moved toward the stair. His hand rested briefly against the railing. He released it. He stepped back toward the center. The faint glow near him did not change. Above, the lantern continued to burn. The flame held steady within the glass. The air remained still. No one spoke. After a time, movement continued again. Edrin moved to the lower shelf. His hand cleared a small section of dust. He lifted a container, turned the lid, checked it, returned it. His hand moved to the next item. He lifted it, turned it, set it down. The position remained consistent. Brenna stepped toward the table. Her hand moved along the edge. She adjusted it slightly. The table settled. She stepped back. Kayla shifted her stance once. She remained near the window. The object on the sill did not move. Thomas stepped toward the table, then stopped. No adjustment followed. The room held its structure. The shelves held their arrangement. The table remained aligned. The book remained open. The door stayed closed. Above, the lantern continued to burn. The flame held steady. The air remained still. No one spoke. The movement slowed, then continued again. Edrin returned to the shelves. His hand moved across the surface. He lifted a container. The lid turned. He checked it. He returned it. His hand moved along the row. Some items were touched. Some were lifted. Each returned to its place. Brenna moved along the wall. Her hand passed across another section. The dust shifted slightly. She stepped back. Kayla stepped once along the sill. She paused near the opening. Her gaze moved outward, then returned to the interior. She remained there. Thomas moved toward the center. He stopped near the table. The faint glow remained unchanged. The room stayed quiet. The air remained still. Above, the lantern continued to burn. The flame held steady within the glass. No one spoke. The book remained open on the table. The entries held their alignment. No new marks appeared. The shelves held their arrangement. The table remained aligned. The door stayed closed. The movement continued in the same way. Small adjustments, brief pauses. return to stillness. Then movement again. The lantern remained lit above. The flame held steady within the glass. The air remained still.